said, it is a privilege and a delight to transfer the baton over to John Windhausen, who's the Executive Director for SHLB, the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, and they are doing lovely, important work, the hard work of policy advocacy and analysis around affordable broadband ubiquitously for all Americans, and it's really glorious work and done brilliantly. John, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. That's very kind of you. And I know I had a great chance to be with you yesterday for the breakout sessions, and one of the key themes of success is partnerships. And that rings really true with me because I think the partnership that SHLB has going on with NCDE is really strong, and it's going to get even stronger going forward. So thank you very much for allowing us to participate with you in this session today, because we have some really interesting research to talk to you about that is really vitally important to the mission that all of you are trying to accomplish and serve, to connect people to high-speed broadband and to the internet. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit today. I'm going to set the stage a little bit about EBS. And just to lay the groundwork, EBS stands for the Educational Broadband Service. It operates at the 2.5 gigahertz range, and it's being used to provide wireless broadband connectivity at speeds that can approach 100 megabits per second at a range of 4 miles. So you see, this is an incredibly useful piece of spectrum, and although it's relatively unknown, it could have an enormous impact on solving the digital divide and addressing the homework gap, especially in these rural markets. And that's because the technology has improved so much over the last 5 years. The equipment is now affordable, it's off the shelf available. Colleges and K-12 school districts are today deploying EBS in some markets. And the Havasupai Native American tribe even deployed EBS service at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So you can see this is very doable. It can be done. Some EBS providers are offering wireless broadband service to low-income families that, get this, only $10 a month. And that's with no data caps. So this is an incredibly great service that can be provided. This is not science fiction. This is not speculative. This is real, and the service can be deployed in just a few weeks. All you need is an FCC license to do that, and that's where this FCC proceeding comes in that we're about to talk to you about. The FCC adopted a notice of proposed rulemaking in the EBS proceeding last May. That NPRM proposed to open up filing windows that would give a preference for Native American tribes and for educational institutions, so that the Native Americans and schools and colleges and universities would get a first crack at obtaining these EBS licenses in these rural markets. The SHLB Coalition filed comments supporting these filing windows, in part because it was consistent with the whole history of the EBS spectrum band. There's a long history of using this band for education. In fact, it was first dedicated for educational purposes back in the early 1960s. So over 50 years ago, the FCC decided this band of spectrum is going to be primarily used for education and to benefit education, and we want to continue that preference going forward. But the last time the FCC authorized the licenses to be issued was in the mid-1990s. Over 20 years ago, there's been a freeze on issuing new licenses. So and a lot of those licenses that were taken back then were taken for the urban markets, but not many for the rural markets. And that's why, as a result, 50% of the geographic territory of the United States, there's no EBS licensee that can take advantage and provide that service. So unfortunately, not everybody is supporting our preferred approach, which is the Windows filing approach, to give that preference to Native Americans and to schools. The commercial carriers prefer to auction these rural EBS licenses to the highest bidder. Auctions would essentially commercialize the spectrum and upend the educational preference that was established over 50 years ago. But most important, auctioning these licenses would not serve the needs of rural America. If EBS licenses are auctioned, they will be gobbled up by the same large national companies that already have spectrum in these rural markets and do not invest enough in rural America because the economic returns just aren't there. Tribal organizations and educational organizations are much more likely to deploy EBS service because they live and work in these rural communities, and they have a mission of serving their communities. So as I said, we filed comments supporting the preference for education. The big commercial companies supported auctions, and they made the argument that auctions would generate more economic value. So that is the question. We said, could that really be true or not? So that is why we invited our guest speaker to talk to us today. So we asked him to analyze the economic benefits of a filing windows approach versus an auctions approach to see what would bring the most economic bang for the buck. And as you'll see, his analysis is quite comprehensive. Dr. Katz examined issues such as the contribution to GDP, high school graduation rates could be impacted by EBS, and the number of students who will be able to access the internet from home to do their homework, the homework app. And we hope you find his analysis very compelling. So, Dr. Raul Katz is an internationally known telecom industry consulting executive. He has provided direction to CEOs and other top management of major telecom firms, and he has developed telecom regulatory strategies for a variety of international organizations and the governments of Colombia, Costa Rica, and Brazil. He is currently president of Telecom Advisory Services, a boutique firm that advises clients in the interrelated fields of strategy and regulation. He's also a director of business strategy research at Columbia University. Dr. Katz received his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has graduate degrees from the Sorbonne in Paris. We are extremely fortunate that he has agreed to conduct this research about the value of EBS spectrum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Raul Katz.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to present today. Let me just reiterate some of the points that John was mentioning as to what is the nature of the problem that we're trying to analyze. And in this map of the United States, you see blue dots. Each blue dot reflects a location, a county, where there is a license held by an educational institution to provide broadband services. Obviously, behind that blue dot could be other licenses that have not been assigned, and you see all the areas of the country that are not covered. This is the issue at stake. There are roughly 4,000 licenses that have not been assigned yet, either within the uncovered areas or within the blue dot at different frequency areas. And the discussion at hand is which would be the optimal way, not only for the economy, but also for society to deal with these licenses. So how do we, what is the issue that is being considered here? Well, as John was mentioning, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is considering at the highest level two potential alternatives. One is to extend the current regime of assigning those upcoming licenses to educational institutions. I said at the highest level because there could be some modifications. As an alternative, there would be the option of putting those for auction. And you might be familiar with those because the way that spectrum is being managed, primarily in this country and overseas, is through auctions. The highest bidder wins a license, which is essentially private property, to offer services in that particular license that they hold, whether it's Verizon or AT&T or the rural communications players. So those are the two options at hand. And what we wanted to do was to introduce some evidence to the discussion. So we weren't just going to argue about these two potential opposite ways of dealing with those licenses, just purely on a purely theoretical way, but also just deal with it with, well, let's put some numbers around these. What do each of those options mean? And ultimately, that's the best way of formulating public policy, is actually generating evidence, empirical evidence, that allows us to make a decision around those two. And make a decision is critical because everything in public policy relates to trade-offs. There's no such a thing as a single option that is better. What you're doing on one of the options, you might be relinquishing some benefits on the one that you don't choose. So we wanted to deal with the trade-off. So the way we approached this, we said, well, let's not put into the analysis the licenses that have already been assigned, which are the ones at the with the red rectangle. Let's just focus on those 4,000 that have not been assigned, that, as John said, covered 15% of the population and 50% of the U.S. territory. And as you can see, just by the ratios, you're basically talking about the rural areas, which is the concentration of the digital divide in this country. We'll come back to this topic. So we were looking at these two alternatives: license to educators, educational institutions, anchor institutions, or put them up for auction for the private sector. What are the numbers around this? And now let's take a step back and say, well, what is the situation that we're trying to optimize? And basically, let's look at the current situation along these 6 levels. What is the nature of the digital divide in this country, in the United States? Well, basically, wireless broadband, which are all the devices that are around the table, all the smartphones, has a penetration of 85%. So there are 15% of the population today that do not have these devices. Secondly, why are they not available? Well, there are 2 reasons. They either don't have the service, they live in an area where they don't get the networks, and therefore there's no use in buying the smartphone. Or secondly, they cannot afford it. It's too expensive. So that's the first thing. How are we going to be able to assess the relative benefits of the 2 options in the reduction of the digital divide? Secondly, the more broadband you have, the more lines you have in a given country, there is a higher impact on the overall size of the economy, of the general domestic product. And that happens because you have more externalities, more commerce, more efficiency of industries, and that has an impact. It has been proven over probably 30 years worth of research. The third element, and John mentioned it, is the issue of the homework gap. There are roughly 5 million kids under 18, according to the American Community Survey of 2017 today, that have a computer at home but don't have broadband. And there's, on the other hand, 2 million kids that do not have either a computer or broadband. And the assumption underlying this is that since teachers today give a lot of homework that requires access on online, we have and I'm talking something that you're very familiar with, about the homework gap. How will these children deal with doing their homework if they cannot access to broadband? Reduction of high school attrition. There's an enormous amount of research of what is the impact of providing broadband at home relative to the, what is the impact on the performance of kids in school. Performance in terms of grades, performance in terms of application to college, performance in terms of applying to more selective colleges. There's one that is particularly important that says that broadband has an impact on attrition, on reducing the dropout rate. And today in this country we have 7.4 high school dropout rate, and of the 70% of high school graduates that apply to college, 1 in 5 quit. Now this is an enormous social problem that we have to see to what extent these 2 options are going to address. And then we have what in economics we call the economic surplus. These are numbers that do not appear in the GDP, but they have to do with, let's assume the case that I'm actually buying broadband and I'm paying $40 a month. And suddenly there's someone that comes in and offers the same kind of service at $10 a month. Well, I'm saving $30. That's called consumer surplus. You won't see that in the GDP, but what you're going to see is that that household can use that $30 to purchase other services or save it. And the same thing applies to libraries. Libraries spend considerable amount of money on broadband. What were to happen if I were to offer to those libraries cheaper service than what they actually incur by purchasing broadband from an AT&T or a Verizon? And finally, there's a contribution to Treasury. As you can imagine, I put these things to auction, and therefore the state, the Treasury, collects money out of what the private sector pays for gaining access to that license. Now, just for you to understand what we're talking about, in the past 2 years, the Federal Communications Commission has collected around $21 billion in auctions for wireless. So just for you to know, this is not a situation where they are starving for income, because there's money that is coming down the line through those auctions. So these are the problems that we're trying to solve, and we're going to go one by one, if time allows, to see the relative benefits of the two options. Let's talk about the reduction of digital divide. And I'm sorry that I'm putting a lot of numbers on you, but I'm just trying to explain the dynamics. What we're focusing on is, in that Venn diagram, in two areas. You're talking about the EBS licenses that are either existing in an area where there is no service, and that's on the non-overlapped area, or in the overlapping area where some of the licenses are in areas where there's at least already one provider of wireless broadband service, an AT&T or Verizon. Well, what happens? If you look at the area where there are licenses available, not yet assigned, and no service, we have today 5.7 million people. 5.7 million people that cannot access wireless broadband. On the other hand, we have, on the areas where there is service, 11 million. 11.4 million. So this is the nature of the digital divide in the areas where there are licenses. There are like 26, probably 27 million people that today don't access broadband, either because they cannot afford it on the left, or because there's no service on the right. So what would the licenses come in and say? Well, on the right, I'm going to offer service, and I'm going to get a certain level of adoption of these people that are starved for service. And we are assuming 58%, because that's what the national penetration in rural areas is of wireless broadband, 58%, which gives us 3 million subscribers. On the other hand, I'm coming in and I'm offering service for $10 a month. Just for you to understand, the cheapest service today in the market, in the US market, is Verizon's $20 a month, which is actually not as good as this, because it's capped to 3 gigabytes, after which your service starts dropping in speed dramatically. So think about it. I could either buy it at 20 or I could buy it at 10. But if I don't buy it, because even 20 is too expensive, at 10 I might buy it. And this is what we call price elasticity. And these kind of price elasticity, I get 5 million subscribers. So the net effect of assigning these licenses to educational institutions through these kind of plans gives us an increment of 8.3 million new subscribers, or an 18% reduction on the digital divide, which is a real number. It is extremely important on what I'm trying to maximize. Now let's look at the alternative. What were to happen if I auction this and a private sector company purchased the spectrum? Well, let's look on the right. What happens essentially, and you can see the numbers at the top are the same. My universe of adoption is the same, 11 million versus 5 million. Well, what happens is, let's talk about the areas where there's no service. A private sector wireless operator invests and deploys service if the financials of the business case make sense. And someone was making reference to it in the prior session. If the numbers, or the net present value, or the internal rate of return don't make sense, they don't invest, because they are obliged to their shareholders that whatever investment they make, it makes sense financially. And what happens is that we run the analysis county by county on those that there's no service, and only 24 out of the 78 have a positive net present value. The rest, no one is going to invest because it doesn't make sense. The shareholders would penalize the wireless carrier. So already, because only have 24 out of the 78, I get less of a benefit. And on the other hand, on the hand of the areas where there is already service, well, the auction is not a relevant issue relative to offer services, because they are already offering services. Therefore, my impact is 0. So when I add the two, I get only 1.49 reduction of digital divide. Think about it. 18% on the other option, 1.5 on this option. So that's the first effect. And let's move to the second one, contribution to the GDP. Essentially what we're talking about is more wireless broadband lines, more impact on the GDP, and there's a number of models that we built over years that quantify the causality that goes between broadband and impact on the economy. So the numbers on the left, you recognize them because I mentioned them before, times the model that we were talking about. Obviously, the impact is going to be higher because you have more lines on the first option of the educational institution assignment option. So more lines, more impact on the GDP. These numbers, and you might not remember, but the U.S. the U.S. GDP is $19 trillion. This is a drop in the bucket. But these models are very important for developing countries and it could be very important in a rural area. It could be very important in a rural area because the GDP in rural areas is very low, and you get the phenomenon of hollowing out. Kids are migrating out of the rural areas. There are no businesses. There's no commerce. And what we're trying to do is stimulate rural development so you can staunch a little bit that migration away from rural areas. Reduction of the homework gap. So here's, again, we start with, look at the red number. Only the homework gap in the country as a whole is 7 million kids, as you might remember from my beginning of the presentation. If you take only the rural counties, it's small. So you see that there's a lot of homework gap in urban areas as well. This is the affordability gap. Huh? This is households that cannot purchase broadband because they don't have the means to. But if we focus on the areas where there are upcoming licenses to be assigned, what we have is, in terms of kids, 87,000 on the areas that already have service, or 154 in the areas that do not have service. Okay, so this is where the licenses would have an impact. I offer the service through an educational institution at $10 a month, and suddenly there are two things. On one hand, on this side, I have an affordability effect, because these households could not afford broadband, and suddenly they can, through the elasticity that I mentioned before. So I get 73,000 children. But more importantly, on the uncovered areas, at $10, I'm going to get the national average of broadband penetration. And that is 85% of adoption. That gives me 128,000 children. That's 200,000 children. Assuming that most of it is in rural areas, I get a 29% reduction of the homework gap in rural areas. This is significant, again. And we're going to come back to this in terms of high school attrition. Now, on the other side, if I were to put that to auction in the same licenses up to auction by a private sector company, the effects are much smaller, because on the side that is being served today, they don't need the spectrum to offer the service. Okay? Now, on the areas that would offer the service, they get just 24 counties. And that really cuts me the impact that I could have. The other thing that I could have of an impact is that, let's assume that we model this with Sprint 1 million program, which is essentially giving broadband for free in certain areas. It just happens that that broadband for free is focused on kids that can justify their poverty level, but only focused on high school. We're saying, no, we won't have any restrictions. You don't need to be in high school. You can be on any of the grades starting at kindergarten. So our impact is much larger. So when I get these reductions, look at the numbers, only 1.13% reduction. You see how the direction is shaping up, how important it is to keep these licenses in the hands of educational institutions. Let's talk about attrition. So far you're tracking. If there are any doubts, please write them down and you can ask me the question. So basically you have 7% of kids in high school that are dropping. And that's the terrible social problem that we have in this country. And in just rural counties, that number is 326,000. What can we do for them? The research indicates that if a kid has access to broadband at home, there's a chance between 6 and 8 percentage points more that that kid is likely to graduate from high school. And that is pretty relevant research. We scanned the research. I mean, there are some things that are, when a kid gets broadband at home, he's not just going to do the homework. Let's recognize that. He's going to play games, he's going to go on social networks, he's going to do all the other things. But this effect is important. It's almost like you extend this educational ecosystem to the household. without even talking about one thing that has been studied quite a bit in Europe. This is when we give the broadband service at home, the kid uses it for homework, but the kid acts as a change agent with the rest of the family, because that kid knows how to operate the technology. So the parents that have the problem of digital literacy suddenly have someone at home that can teach them how to use the technology. And that effect is fundamental in terms of breaking the digital divide. We're getting into another effect of what explains the digital divide. People don't use it or don't access because they don't know what to do with it. And there the kid is very important. But we are even leaving that aside. But what we see is that just in terms of providing this broadband, you get 43,000 kids. Now you might say, well, 43,000 kids on the overall universe. Well, this is important because the social malaise, the social problems that are associated with high school dropouts is enormous in this country. We want to really reduce that percentage more. The other effect that is important is the hotspot lending, which I think someone has made reference to. Basically, the effect is that anchor institutions such as libraries or schools provide service to their community through the service that they can allow to offer. And in this case, these are the number of schools. We didn't focus on libraries, but look at the number of schools, because we're talking about attrition. So we have 3,600 schools in areas that are not served by broadband. They offer the service, they get penetration, and I get quite a bit of impact as well in terms of reduction of attrition. So between the channel effect, the indirect through the anchor institutions, and the one going directly to the household, I get roughly 67,000 kids that are going to stay in high school until they graduate. Alternatively, if I give them to the commercial sector, because of the haircuts that occur between the number of counties that they can offer service and the restrictions that a program such as Sprint 1 million has, my impact is like nominal. It's 1,500. So you see how we looked at 3 areas of impact where there was really dramatic differences between one option and the other. One of them is economic surplus. I'm going to skip this, but these are the savings that students, the households realize by purchasing a cheaper service, or libraries incur by purchasing a cheaper service. Both things are, it's called either producer surplus or consumer surplus. And finally, I'm going to skip this for lack of time. I'm going to talk about the contribution to the Treasury. How much money would they get? How much money would the government get if they were to put up to auction? We don't think that they will get a lot of money, simply because these licenses are in rural areas, which are less attractive to private sector companies, and in some cases, the spectrum there is highly encumbered. Between those two effects, we believe that they're going to collect just $52 million, which is a drop in the bucket relative to what they have collected in the past, and the social and economic effects that they would be foregoing by not assigning it to educational institutions. So the net, let me just skip to it, this is the net. These are the ledger. This is the ledger. The middle column is the EBS licenses. The overlay auction is if we were to put up for auction by the for private sector companies. On reduction of digital divide, there's no comparison of what effect would have if I keep it within educational institutions. In terms of impact on the GDP, commensurately. But more importantly, as I referred before, the impact in rural areas. The reduction of homework gap is 200,000 kids versus 7,500. And the social effects that this has are enormous, that go well beyond the numbers in and of itself. Economic surplus, there's relative savings. Let's look at producer surplus for anchor institutions. The libraries would be saving $98 million over 5 years that they could use to develop other community activities, purchase more books, purchase more educational material or activities. So clearly they could shift those monies to other areas. And obviously we don't have any contribution to Treasury on the assignment to educational institutions because they are assigned for free. But the other option has an impact on $52 million. So why is it that these two are so drastically different, these two options, and why the middle one makes so much sense? Well, there are several reasons. The first one is the deployment economics. The fact is that we are not going to break the digital divide purely based on private sector investment. The density of some of these counties, you have 2,000 square miles with 15,000 people. You can never make money, and therefore a private sector company will never invest. If we think that they're going to invest, we're dreaming, because nowhere around the world has that happened. Secondly, if they get more spectrum, that wouldn't change, because they're still constrained by CapEx. They're still constrained by operating expenditures. The fact is that today, the commercial carriers do not have an offer focused on the less vulnerable population. The fact is today that at $20 a month for 3 gigabytes, that's not enough. $20 a month is roughly 3.5% of the monthly income of people at the lowest decile of the population. What the International Broadband Commission says is that for service to be available, it has to be at least at 2% of the monthly income. So we have a gap simply because people cannot buy it. They don't have the money at the lowest decile of the population. So thinking that we're going to solve the problem of the digital divide simply by giving more spectrum is a dream. If we don't address the social problem by less expensive offers, that is not going to happen. The only offer that exists today that is commercially driven is the Sprint 1 Million initiative. And that is restricted to just the high school students and has other restrictions as well in terms of cap service and the like, which services such as those provided by Mobile Beacon or Mobile Citizen that are focused on institutions like schools, libraries, and nonprofits are much more generous, both in terms of the lower price and in terms of the kind of service that they provide. Less caps, essentially. And even if we were to put it up for auction, the numbers don't justify. If you were to tell me, I'm going to collect $1.5 billion, and those monies are going to go to universal service, well, let's talk. I mean, it's happening in 5G with the airwaves auction, where 10% of the proceeds are going to rural deployment. This is not the case. So this doesn't really compensate for the harm that this kind of a decision is going to take. So just to wrap up, if we think about trade-offs, if we think about evidence, the option of assigning the spectrum to the educational institutions makes a ton of sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katz. And we're going to have a question and answer period here in just a minute, but before we get to that, I'd like to invite Missy Green and Ellen Satterwhite to the stage to make a couple of comments. And yes, Bob, do these microphones work on the chairs here? Okay, great. Dr. Katz, I was struck by your comment about how the students take the internet home with them and then educate their parents, because that's a theme that came up yesterday in one of our breakout sessions, and how valuable that is as an additional sort of multiplier effect of getting broadband to the home. Doesn't just benefit the students, but benefits their parents as well. Come on up on stage.
And there's research to that effect, research done at Carnegie Mellon, research done in Europe, in Germany as well, that actually proves how the kid is actually a change agent within the household. In fact, in Germany, they've built a program around this where the children have to train the grandparents.
Grandparents?
Yeah, just to break the generational gap, because as you can imagine, as we all experience in our families, grandparents tend not to be that into the technology. So they formalized that in Germany. So there's actually these kind of courses where kids are obliged. If you get the access for free, your obligation is to do training programs with your grandparents.
Oh, that's great, Bob. That's a great next project addition to the NCDE agenda, right? That's cool. Missy Green from the State Educational Technology Directors Association, what did you think of Dr. Katz's comments?
I think his evidence is very compelling, and CETA has been involved in publishing broadband work for over 10 years now, and has an interest and continues to find ways for state leadership to contribute to make a difference. But I think what is really, really compelling is that we know that EBS can connect tens of thousands of schools and libraries and other anchor institutions, meaning it serves millions of schools and families that would not otherwise be served. And I think that it makes a meaningful difference in these communities, and that's really what we care about, is how it connects those children so that they have a better future, to combat the digital divide. So that was my takeaway, and I think the evidence, again, is very compelling.
Oh, I have my own now. I agree. It was a compelling presentation.
Ellen Satterwhite.
I'm Ellen
fellow.
Satterwhite. I'm a policy fellow with the American Library Association, and we do appreciate that Dr. Katz referenced specifically community anchor institutions, including libraries and the hotspot lending programs, which libraries have really seen between 2015 and 2018 an explosion in these projects in communities, particularly in rural communities. And we estimate that under the current EBS rules, more than 500 libraries have developed partnerships with nonprofit providers of mobile hotspot services to serve their communities. What I thought was particularly the nuance in this discussion is that these hotspots aren't subject to the sort of data caps and kind of restrictions that other mobile broadband services often are. And I think as educators know, and those of us that talk about digital equity know, that quality really matters. And as video and more sort of enriched online content is part of the homework and learning experience, it matters that you don't have a cap put in and buffering and I can't get through the video. It's not about, I think as we all know, it's not about cat videos and TikTok. It's about a mobile learning experience and really taking those equitable experiences home. So I found that pretty compelling, and we've filed a letter as the American Library Association at the FCC talking about a couple of the programs at work in communities that we work with that I encourage people to look at.
Great. And Missy, can you answer the question, are schools really interested in deploying this service? Do you have schools, departments
Yes,
in
and
CETA?
I have examples from rural schools especially, so it impacts rural educators. And because it makes it possible for kids to have access to educational services, it also impacts economic growth, and it can help close the homework gap. And so many of our state leaders serve rural communities, and this is where it can really, really be felt. And we have an example in one of our published reports that Northern Michigan University is a wonderful example of how this can be applied. In 2014, they have applied for 6 additional EBS licenses, and they've influenced and been able to impact the neighboring rural communities in a very, very positive way. So these networks are really being utilized and really making a difference. That impact is measurable.
And I know the state of Nebraska, that's a member of CETA, it's also a member of SHLB, has expressed their sincere desire they would like to get EBS licenses so they could provide coverage over the whole state of Nebraska,
Absolutely.
North Carolina, I think, and Utah too.
Yep, and we can have, I think, a way or a forum to share and highlight those best practices combined with this type of data. I do think it's very compelling, and it tells a great story of the difference it can make.
And Ellen, back to you. I think you've got some examples of library hotspots, in fact, where
I
they
do.
started. Yes, go ahead.
Yes,
Tell
I
us about
do.
them.
And I would encourage folks, and I can send anyone who's interested, there is some great research that we anticipate being released sometime later this month from Dr. Sharon Strover and her colleagues at the University of Texas on this issue. So it's actively under study, and similarly, we are looking for this data to come in because we know it works. But just a couple examples. So Providence Community Library in Rhode Island is one of several libraries that loans out hotspots. And these hotspots are loaned out to patrons in neighborhoods where broadband adoption is low, and they can support up to 8 users at a time. And as I mentioned, these hotspots don't have a data cap, and we've done some estimation of just one online course with video, so one online Coursera course, for example, can consume 2.5 gigabytes of data. which you're going to hit you're going to hit a data cap pretty quickly if you're trying to do that on your phone or you're trying to do that via some other commercial means. So the community in Providence has found that is a real differentiator, particularly with the homework app. Also in Oakland, in California, Oakland Public Library has started a hotspot lending program with 15 hotspots, and they quickly discovered that hotspots are selling like hotcakes, and they had enough demand for 50. I mean, if you talk to these librarians, they are always checked out. There is always a waiting list. There is always a hold list. The hotspots, interestingly enough, have also been used by library staff at mobile events and on bookmobiles. And this is critical, especially in rural areas, but also in areas where libraries are really going out into the community to be part of adult education and early literacy efforts, where they want to connect with and meet people where they are. These hotspots help libraries actually do the business of being libraries.
I love that. Hotspots are selling like hotcakes. I don't know why we haven't come up with that line before, but that's your brilliance.
You can have it. You can have it. That can be yours.
So we'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes where we could entertain your questions, and we'd love to hear from you. Bob is making signals, and he's willing to take the microphone around the room for anybody who'd love to ask a question.
You're going to have this answer most of the questions. We can shout.
Any questions? Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have just two questions. First question is to Dr. Katz. I was looking at the map, and I wanted to double check what I had in my hand. I don't see anything, the Universal License System data for Alaska, and I was wondering if there are licenses up there, because I was wondering about the Alaskan Native community and how, because I know that they severely have problems getting to have internet and mobile data, broadband data. And the second one is I noticed that I wanted to ask more about how nonprofits can utilize this program, the EBS system,
EBS.
because I see it in libraries, schools, but I wanted to find out how, because you have a lot of community nonprofits, organizations that primarily serve middle school, lower income, or rural children and younger, and they do a lot of reading programs. They have a lot of book programs, bookmobiles, and things like that that are all nonprofit organizations. And how would they be able to bring those hotspots out?
Two good questions. Dr. Katz first.
Yeah, definitely Alaska is a big issue. There are licenses available, and we have a lack of service. I mean, when you start looking at the different, they're called census areas or boroughs in Alaska, they are uncovered. Unserved. And so there's definitely an opportunity. What we have to grapple with there is the extension of those boroughs, because from a density standpoint, you're talking about some of them having, maybe 14,000 square miles with 7,000 people living there. So you have to see how you manage that. But there's definitely an opportunity, because I see that Alaska, I agree with you, there's definitely a glaring black zone in that particular territory. Beyond the major cities.
And
So
the
as-
nonprofit
The nonprofit question.
opportunities for nonprofits as well?
So would you like to ask, or I could also call on Catherine Messier in the audience? Go ahead, Catherine.
She would be perfect to address that.
Yeah.
You can hand the microphone to Catherine.
Yes, so under the existing rules today, nonprofit organizations whose mission is to serve the needs of accredited educational institutions, that's the category that we fall into, were eligible to get an EBS license. However, under the current EBS rulemaking, the FCC has proposed to eliminate that category of eligibility, so nonprofits would not be eligible if there is an educational window.
Right, boo, exactly, boo.
And I can add some data to that from one of our reports that Mobile Beacon's uncapped 4G LTE service is used by 848 schools, 950 libraries, and 4,759 nonprofit organizations throughout the country. So it's a means for schools and districts to have access on and off campus. It's important.
We put together a one-pager just summarizing some of the existing EBS rules and that recognize what Catherine said, who's eligible today. And these nonprofit organizations are eligible under the current rules, but that's exactly what is being proposed to change onto this new FCC proceeding. And so this is really an unfortunate situation. Now, it's not been decided yet, and that's why we're holding this briefing. That's why we asked Dr. Katz to make this economic analysis, because the FCC is poised to make a decision. We hope they don't rush to a judgment on this, because the trends are going not in a favorable direction for nonprofits. And that's why we're trying to turn that around and convince the FCC to do the right thing and preserve this educational preference. Other questions?
I've got one.
Bob, yes, go ahead.
What do we do about this?
Well, it's a key critical moment because there are rumors, and we can't say for sure, but there are rumors that the FCC may try to reach a decision on this summer. But we think that would be premature. And the SHLB Coalition, along with several other parties, just filed a letter on Monday, 2 days ago, asking for the FCC to hold off on a decision until it takes a look at some of the key requirements and the key implications of this proceeding. One of them is this new study by Dr. Katz. I mean, he just did this enormous amount of economic research that is a lot of new analysis and information. That deserves to be put out for additional comment. I mean, we want to really flesh out the record here in order to make sure that before the FCC moves, that it has the benefit of all of this economic analysis, not just from Dr. Katz, but from others who might want to comment on it. Secondly, we've got a big proceeding with regard to the Sprint T-Mobile merger. And we don't have a position on whether that merger is good or bad, but I will say Sprint is the largest user of the EBS spectrum. And we don't know how that merger, how it's going to be decided, what the implications are for the EBS marketplace. It would really be premature for the FCC to make a decision in the EBS rulemaking until it knows how the merger decision is going to be reached. So we would like to encourage all of you, back to your question, Bob, about what you can do. We would love to be able to work with all of you in order to help educate the FCC. I think there's a big question mark about will schools and tribal nations and colleges and universities actually use these licenses if they're awarded to them? I think we have a lot of evidence that they will. And the market has changed from 20 years ago. And so these licenses are much more capable of offering very low-cost service. But we need the FCC to hear from you. They need to know that you are interested in providing this service. So the more that we can send that message to the FCC and to Capitol Hill, to encourage them to convince the FCC to preserve this preference for nonprofits and educational institutions. That's a really important, and this is a critical moment in the history of EBS. Yes, question?
Just had a question that you just mentioned with regard to the Sprint T-Mobile merger. One of the things under consideration in terms of continuation is the Sprint 1 Million Project Foundation, which you cited in your research just a moment ago. Any idea if there's any assurances in terms of that program continuing under the new merger? And for people that don't know, Sprint is making an attempt to take some of that 5 or 7 million, whatever number you look at. It's 5 million students that can't do their homework at night. And so they set up this program to offer hotspots and so forth, and any school can qualify for it. There were limitations and data caps and all these things, but I think some of those things have fallen away because of complaints and so forth, but it's free. The school has to administer it, set somebody up to do it, but they'll provide all the hardware and software to run it.
So that's a good question. Dr. Katz, have you done a prognosis of the future of the Sprint 1 Million project?
No.
No.
But I mean, the question is very relevant. I mean, if you've been following a little bit the situation at Sprint and the merger, Sprint is a carrier that is under considerable amount of financial pressure. Obviously, 1 million in and of itself is not going to move the needle one way or the other, but it is an issue on the table. Let's assume for the sake of the argument that they continue. We still have that restriction, both on the nature of the service and the population that it addresses, which is only high school students. So even within the 7 million or the 5 million within the area that they can offer service, it's a subset of that population. We're thinking, no, that in order to improve attrition, to reduce the homework gap, we have to extend beyond high school. And there's no other offer comparable to Sprint's by the other national carriers. So even if it were to continue, we still have an issue with the additional risk that it might be discontinued, as there are some rumors around. So we will be left with a zero effect, essentially. Let's be also clear, I mean, at least the numbers that were provided to us, they have right now roughly 200,000 students within their user community, which is, again, it's a drop in the bucket relative to the numbers that we are providing. By the way, it's important, these 7 million is important to retain because these are the American Community Survey data done by the Census Bureau. These are essentially national household surveys. So it's the most reliable data that we have. Again, it includes, as I mentioned before, kids that can have a computer and don't have broadband or do not have either technology. And that's the number. The 7 million is the number that needs to be addressed one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. And Art, I believe I recall reading that in New York, that T-Mobile made a commitment to continue the Sprint 1 million project in New York, and I also think that there's some work in California as a part of that merger proceeding, where they have made some additional commitments in California. But the question is, those are just 2 states. And are we in a situation now where the commitment is going to vary from state to state? That's one of the big questions we don't know, that we ought to find out and resolve before we make this precipitous decision to just get rid of EBS as a separate standalone service. We need to know that factual information before the FCC should move forward. Yeah.
So on the license that have been extended for the last 2 decades, is there been an evaluative or a research basis on how they're actually being used? These are some great examples. I know there's been terrific things that have happened, but is there hard data that's tracked these licenses and the impact they've had?
Well, I think that's what Dr. Katz has been drawing upon, correct? Some real-world examples.
Yeah, definitely. Now, in terms of, I think probably organizations such as Mobile Beacon has had considerable amount of research on the savings conducted by libraries or realized by libraries as a result of purchasing their service. Just to give you one, for instance, the average monthly savings of the institution served by Mobile Beacon is around $1,200 a month, which when we add it, it's considerable amount of money in terms of things that they could do in terms of purchasing other services or books or educational material, whatever it is. So that, I'm just giving you one hard data point along those lines. In addition, obviously, the Northern Michigan University, the adherence of the penetration of their services in the community has been quite relevant. I don't have at the top of my head exactly penetration numbers, but those are important. And they have a different sort of levels of service, but the one that is at the $10 level, for instance, includes students, not only at the university, but students in general, veterans as well. They have the ability to purchase at $10. And then it goes a little bit higher if you are a member of the community. But at that point, you get, for instance, $34.95, the service that they provide for a community member. And in terms of apples to what a commercial carrier would charge for that kind of service, you're talking about $60. Between $60 and $80 what a Sprint or an AT&T would be carrying. So you see there the benefits that occur for members of the community. But I think your point is very relevant, I mean, in terms of going back historically and provide the line of benefits that have been generated so far, I think.
Each of the license holders was really what I was asking about, have they all been active with their license?
Yes. No, I do agree.
Yes, and I'd say there were 6 licenses that were awarded in the last few years that they got waivers from the FCC to deploy EBS. All 6 of them have been deployed successfully. And the Northern Michigan University, just to add to that, was really interesting because they began deploying just to the students because that was their core function. And the rest of the community stood up and said, well, wait, what about us? We'd love to get access to that even if we don't have students. So Northern Michigan now is designed a service offering for just the general public in that area, so much so that the governor of Michigan has asked Northern Michigan University to extend their service down into the lower peninsula because it's been so successful in the upper peninsula. Yes, Catherine.
Yes. So I just wanted to add on, because I know you had a question about the merger and whether there's been any commitment to extend the 1 million project. As an EBS licensee, I mean, one of my concerns is a little bit different. I want to know if there's a merger, if T-Mobile has made any assurances or commitments to uphold the programs that I run and support and that are used by schools and libraries across the country. And I do know that the answer to that is no. We have reached out to T-Mobile. We have, raised this issue in the docket, and there still is no response or no acknowledgement to the EBS community. And given that they are the largest commercial lessee in the United States, this has huge implications in the EBS rulemaking proceeding. Because if the FCC were to lift that educational eligibility, T-Mobile's in a very different situation than Sprint is. They could pressure licensees to sell out. They could stop offering lease terms, which would kill the incentives that actually created all of these programs in the first place. I did also just have one quick comment, because I know you asked about, is there sort of an across-the-board look at what licensees are doing? And the FCC does what they call substantial service tests. It's kind of a snapshot in time, where they have all licensees describe their programs and their levels of service. But the last one wasn't done since 2011, so it's been almost 10 years. And I think that that's one of the reasons why SHLB and our organizations have called for a delay. We think that there should be more information on the record before the FCC determines the best path, because you have to know what's happening today to know what's at risk and what's at stake.
And Ellen, did you? No. Yep, you're okay? All right. Another question? Yes.
This may be low tech, but I really believe in advocacy in terms of your local representatives and senators. I don't know how many of the Democratic field have talked about the importance of education and giving teachers all kinds of raises and so on and so forth. But even so, the FCC is independent. The Senate has influence on it. I know when the net neutrality issue came up, and that's still out there, our 2 senators from New Hampshire were belaboring the point constantly, and they still are. So I do think that, the power of phone calls and letters or emails, but honestly phone calls work the best, is really important. What senator or representative doesn't care about education, especially in those states that are going to suffer?
Well, that's very well said.
Well, I was just going to say that it is not low-tech. I saw the FCC oversight hearing that was just going on a couple of today. Yeah. A couple of our members of Congress did ask questions, and the whole point is that they should have time to ask those questions, and I think our organizations encourage the asking of those questions, and from an advocacy perspective, you're exactly right. Asking them to do, them being our members of Congress, to do their oversight duty with this independent regulatory agency is entirely appropriate.
And we did work together collaboratively to generate a letter of, I think, 850 organizations that signed a letter to the FCC supporting the retention of these educational use rules. We also obtained a letter from 57 wireless operators. So these are private sector companies that are saying, don't auction this, because we'd much rather partner with the schools and deliver this service, and they're not going to be able to compete in an auction. So we've got support from the commercial sector, we've got support, grassroots support, we've got support from schools and libraries and state departments of education, but we all need to focus our energy. There is a website that Catherine has put together, saveebs.org, and there's more information available on that website if anybody is interested in drilling down more into this issue. And then you could sign up for even more information. But really, we're at the end of our time today, but this is a super critical issue going forward. So if any of you are interested in working with us to try to convince the FCC to make the right decision, we would love to work with you. We hope that you reach out to us, and we would enjoy the chance to work with you on that. So Bob, I think that's a wrap from
That's
us.
super,
Really
I think it is.
appreciate
And if I
the
could just add one last point, is that I'll make sure that the folks who attended the summit the last day and a half, they get the link to saveebs.org and to the work that you're doing.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.